For decades they waited, they trained in mountain camps most people will never find on a map. They buried their weapons in the same soil their grandparents were buried in. They watched their leaders get assassinated in European cities by Iranian intelligence agents who crossed borders like tourists and killed like professionals. They watched their language get banned, their villages get shelled, their young men disappear into the machinery of a regime that has never once treated them as anything other than a threat to be contained or an enemy to be eliminated. They waited through the years when the world was not watching. They waited through the diplomatic cycles that came and went without producing anything that changed their fundamental reality. They waited through the periods of quiet that were never really quiet for the people living them. And then, in March of this year, the most powerful country on earth looked them in the eye, promised them air cover, promised them a future, told them to choose a side, watched them mobilize thousands of fighters into position near the Iranian border, and then walked away. No formal apology, no negotiated withdrawal, just silence from Washington and a newly emboldened Revolutionary Guard on the other side of the line, now fully aware of exactly which fighters had been preparing to move. That betrayal should have been the end of the story. Every precedent said so. Every lesson from 1975, from 1991, from every other time a Western power used Kurdish blood as a bargaining chip and then folded the card when it became inconvenient, said these fighters should have scattered back into the mountains and gone quiet for another decade. They did not go quiet. They did the one thing nobody in Tehran or Washington expected. They kept fighting anyway, on their own terms, without waiting for anyone's permission or air cover or green light. And what they just did on a mountain road near a town called Piranshar has sent shockwaves through the Iranian security apparatus in ways the regime is working very hard to make sure you never hear about. Before I walk you through exactly what happened, why it terrifies Tehran far more than another round of airstrikes ever could, and why the next 90 days will determine whether Iran's western frontier holds together or cracks open permanently, do me a quick favor, hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds. It costs nothing. And it tells the algorithm that this kind of unfiltered analysis deserves to reach people who actually want to understand what is happening instead of just skimming headlines. If you are new here, subscribe immediately and tap that notification bell. This is where we look at what is actually going on. And what is actually going on right now in the mountains of Western Iran is a story almost nobody is telling you. Here's the version of this conflict that dominates every headline, every cable news segment, every satellite photo analysis you have seen for the past 5 months. The United States and Israel struck Iran's nuclear facilities. Bunker busters hit Fordo. The Strait of Hormuz became a flashpoint for global oil markets. Stealth jets, sea drones, precision missiles, a modern air campaign executed with overwhelming technological superiority against a regime struggling to defend its coastline and its nuclear program simultaneously. That is the war everyone is watching. It is real, it is significant, and it is extensively covered. But there is another war happening right now, hundreds of kilometers to the west of those headlines, in terrain the Iranian government has always treated as its own private problem to manage in silence. No press conferences, no international mediators, no satellite imagery for analysts to study, just mountain villages, ambush points, and a decades-old insurgency that everyone assumed had been permanently subdued. That assumption just collapsed, and the collapse happened so quietly that most of the world has not noticed yet. That silence is not accidental. It is the product of a deliberate strategy on both sides. Iran does not want the world to know that Kurdish fighters are operating and dying inside its own claimed territory in coordinated waves across multiple provinces. The Kurdish organizations involved are careful about publicity because drawing too much international attention without the military backing to sustain it has historically made them targets rather than heroes. And Western governments, particularly the United States, have no incentive to draw attention to a front they encouraged, armed, and then abandoned within the span of 2 weeks in March. So the coverage stays focused on the Gulf, on the nuclear question, on the diplomatic track, and the war that could actually determine what Iran looks like 5 years from now keeps burning in the mountains where almost nobody outside the region is paying attention. I need you to stay with me through this entire analysis because by the time I am done, you will understand something about this conflict that the daily frontline coverage has entirely failed to communicate. This is not about a handful of skirmishes on a remote border. This is about the single most dangerous fault line inside the Iranian state, the one crack in the foundation the regime has spent 50 years hoping nobody else would notice, splitting open at the exact moment when Iran has fewer resources to contain it than at any point in its modern history. To understand why what just happened matters so much, you need to understand what the current war has done to Iran's ability to manage its Kurdish frontier. Because the answer to that question is the key to understanding why these fighters chose this specific moment to escalate. Iran's security architecture has always operated on an assumption of simultaneous capacity. The Revolutionary Guard, the conventional army, The intelligence services, the paramilitary forces, together they constituted an apparatus large enough that suppressing Kurdish insurgency in the northwest, countering Baluch separatism in the southeast, managing internal dissent across major cities, and projecting power through proxy networks across the broader Middle East were all manageable at the same time. The system was stretched at points, but it held. The months of conflict with the United States and Israel have fundamentally broken that calculation. The IRGC has suffered significant losses of personnel, equipment, and institutional capacity. Units that would normally provide backup and reinforcement to border security forces have been redeployed to defend the southern coastline or have had their operational readiness degraded by sustained airstrikes. The intelligence apparatus has been disrupted by the loss of senior figures. The economic strain of the conflict, layered on top of years of sanctions, has created resource competition within the security establishment that makes every commitment more expensive in relative terms than it would have been 2 years ago. Into this environment, simultaneously weakened and distracted, Kurdish fighters moved. And they moved in a way that tells you this was not improvised. This was the execution of plans held in readiness for exactly this moment, activated when the assessment was made that the conditions for large-scale operations had finally arrived. What those operations actually looked like tells you everything about both the sophistication of the Kurdish organizations involved and the specific vulnerabilities they were designed to exploit. On July 1st, the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, one of the oldest and most organized Kurdish factions, announced that 6 of its Peshmerga fighters had been killed in a direct clash with the Revolutionary Guard near the town of Piranshar, deep inside Iranian territory. The IRGC claimed 5 Kurdish militants killed in what they called a counterterrorism operation. The Kurdish group called it an ambush. Strip away the competing narratives and one fact remains undeniable. This was not a border skirmish. This was a sustained firefight happening inside Iran's own claimed territory, months after the official ceasefire, in a region Tehran has always insisted it fully controls. That was the first crack. That same week, Iran's Revolutionary Guard reported the deaths of 2 of its own members in what officials called a terrorist act in the city of Pave, an attack claimed by a newly formed Kurdish group calling itself Zorhiwa, meaning Son of Hope, a name almost nobody outside the region had heard before this year. The emergence of new organizations in an insurgency is one of the most significant signals military analysts track because it indicates that the movement is expanding beyond its established structures, drawing in fighters and resources that did not exist within the traditional organizational framework. That was the second crack. Days later, the IRGC announced a separate counterterrorism operation in West Azerbaijan province, right along the Iraqi border, claiming to have destroyed a 6-member infiltration team. The Kurdistan Free Life Party confirmed that 4 of its own fighters were killed in clashes near the city of Mahabad during that same window. A third organization, a third province, the same handful of days. That was the third crack. And then the assassination. On July 2nd, Saran Mohammadzadeh, a member of the Kurdistan Freedom Party, was killed in Erbil, the capital of Iraq's semi-autonomous Kurdistan region, the very city that is supposed to offer these opposition figures safety. Whoever carried out that killing sent an unmistakable message. Iran's reach extends well beyond its own borders into the very heart of territory that was supposed to be a sanctuary. That was not a crack. That was the regime's counterpunch, and the speed of it tells you exactly how seriously Tehran is taking what is happening on its western frontier. 4 events, 4 different organizations, 4 different provinces spread across hundreds of kilometers of mountainous terrain along almost the entire length of Iran's border with Iraq. One unmistakable conclusion. This is not one isolated incident that can be managed with a single counterterrorism sweep. This is a pattern of nearly simultaneous operations spreading across multiple provinces at once, exactly the kind of decentralized, low-level insurgency that is almost impossible for a conventional military to fully suppress because it does not rely on a single command structure that can be beheaded with one airstrike. That convergence of independent action across such a wide geographic spread is the most important signal to emerge from Iran's western frontier in years. It is not a fluke, it is not border noise, it is a pattern, and patterns, when they emerge across independent organizations simultaneously, tell you something fundamental about the reality that produced them. Here is where the silence becomes its own story, and perhaps a more important story than the clashes themselves, because almost nobody is talking about what just happened in the mountains of western Iran, not in the way it deserves. The coverage stays focused on the Gulf, on the nuclear track, on the diplomatic negotiations in Doha. The Kurdish front barely registers as a footnote, And that silence is not a reflection of insignificance. It is a reflection of how inconvenient this story is for every major actor involved. Tehran does not want the world to know that it is fighting a two-front war, one along its coast against a foreign military superpower and one along its western mountains against a domestic insurgency it claimed to have permanently contained. The United States does not want attention drawn to a front it encouraged, armed, and then abandoned in the span of 2 weeks when Turkish pressure made the political cost too high. Turkey does not want any coverage that might frame Kurdish fighters as legitimate resistance rather than terrorists, because that framing threatens Ankara's own decades-long campaign against Kurdish autonomy within its borders. And the Kurdish organizations themselves operate in a media environment where drawing international attention without the military backing to sustain the resulting pressure has historically made them more vulnerable, not less. So every actor with influence over how this story gets told has a reason to keep it quiet. The result is a war that is genuinely happening. Fighters dying on both sides, provinces destabilized, a regime's western frontier splitting open, being processed by the global information system as though it is not particularly important. The people fighting and dying in those mountains know exactly how important it is. The generals in Tehran sending reinforcements know exactly how important it is. But every institutional system designed to communicate that reality to the rest of the world is working to ensure that almost nobody else fully grasps it. If this analysis is clicking for you in a way that the mainstream coverage never has, take 10 seconds right now. Subscribe if you have not already, tap the notification bell so you get alerted the instant new analysis drops, and share this video with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening on Iran's most overlooked front line. This kind of analysis does not spread by accident. It spreads because viewers like you decide it should. Now, I need to talk about the human dimension of this because there is a detail buried in all of this strategic analysis that matters more than any of it. Think of a man we will call Kawa. We do not know his real name. He is a composite, stand-in for what Kurdish political leaders and press reports have described when they talk about the fighters filling the ranks of organizations along the border right now. Kawa is in his early 20s. His grandfather fought in the Kurdish uprisings of the 1970s and was abandoned when the United States cut a deal with Iraq in 1975. His father watched the uprising encouraged by Washington after the Gulf War get crushed when the ceasefire lines were drawn and American support evaporated overnight. Kawa himself watched what happened in March of this year. He watched thousands of fighters mobilize near Marivan, believing American air power would clear the skies above them. He learned through news reports, not through any direct communication from the supposed allies, that the offensive had been called off. No apology, no explanation, just silence. According to Kurdish political leaders, recruitment has surged rather than collapsed in the months since that betrayal. One Kurdish political figure described a wave of proud, committed younger fighters filling the ranks of parties and camps across the border. That detail is the single most important piece of information in this entire story, because it tells you that the Kurdish resistance has crossed a psychological threshold that no amount of American betrayal or Iranian firepower can reverse. Kawa is not fighting because Washington promised him a future. He is fighting because Washington proved to him, for the third generation in a row, that no one will hand him one. And he decided to build it himself. A movement that survives betrayal and grows afterward is a fundamentally different kind of threat than one that depends on outside backing. It is slower, less spectacular, less likely to produce the kind of dramatic territorial gains that make headlines, but it is also far harder to kill because its fuel source is not American dollars or Israeli intelligence. Its fuel source is a grievance that has been compounding for 100 years, and a generation that has decided, promises or no promises, air cover or no air cover, that the fight itself has become worth continuing on its own terms. Now zoom out with me, because this is the frame that changes everything. Every empire has a fault line it refuses to look at directly. The one crack in the foundation it hopes nobody else notices. For the Ottoman Empire, it was the Balkans. For the Soviet Union, it was the Baltic states and the Caucasus. For the Islamic Republic of Iran, it has always been Kurdistan. Not the version on a map with clean borders, but the lived reality of millions of ethnic Kurds spread across the mountains of western Iran who have maintained a distinct cultural, linguistic, and political identity that has been in tension with the centralizing ambitions of every government in Tehran going back well before the Islamic Republic existed. The history of empires tells us something consistent and uncomfortable. Empires do not collapse from the center first. They crack at the periphery. The frontier that the capital stopped paying attention to, the province whose grievances were managed through force rather than addressed through politics, the population that was treated as a problem to be contained rather than a people to be governed. When the center weakens, the periphery moves. That is not a prediction about Iran's future. It is a description of a pattern that has repeated across centuries and continents. And right now, the center of the Islamic Republic is weaker than it has been at any point in its 47-year history. Its supreme leader was killed in an airstrike. His successor has not appeared in public in over 4 months. Its nuclear program has been struck. Its navy has been degraded. Its air defenses have been systematically suppressed. Its economy is hemorrhaging under sanctions and war costs simultaneously. And along its western frontier, in the mountains, it is always treated as a closed, silent problem to be managed through overwhelming force and targeted assassination. Fighters who have been waiting for generations just demonstrated that the force is no longer overwhelming and the silence is no longer holding. Iran has survived Kurdish uprisings before. It will almost certainly survive this current wave without losing formal control of its western provinces in the immediate future. But survival is not the same thing as stability. And every ambush near Piranshar, every assassination in Erbil, every new organization like Zorahiwa emerging from a generation that has decided to fight without permission is a small crack widening in a wall that already took a direct hit when a sitting supreme leader was killed in February. The war everyone is watching is happening in the Gulf. The war that could actually determine what Iran looks like 5 years from now is happening quietly in the mountains in a fight almost nobody outside the region is paying attention to, and the fighters waging that war are not waiting for anyone's permission to continue. They stopped waiting in March. They are not going to start again. If this analysis helped you see something the headlines missed, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your assessment in the comments. Share this with one person who deserves to understand what just cracked open on Iran's western frontier. The mountains do not forget, and neither do the people who have been fighting in them for 100 years.